So, with Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia attending the NATO summit, clearly China is a concern for the alliance. Multiple discussions took place, ranging from belligerent Chinese conduct in the South China Sea to China's relationship with Russia. One thing that came out before this meeting is the agreement to put a NATO liaison office in Tokyo. Now, NATO's 2022 strategic concept highlighted China as a challenge to member countries' interests, security, and values. China employs aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy, and that's their term, not ours. And it's where Chinese diplomats, under the guidance of Xi Jinping, use overtly hostile rhetoric. They saber rattle. They try to challenge even the smallest slights against the Chinese government, the CCP, and the people of China as some sort of recompense for the 100 years of humiliation they experienced. Now, China has also implemented coercive policies to weaponize strategic dependencies in such areas like the sea transit, like trying to block off areas to stop transit of trade, take over territory that is absolutely the territorial waters of other countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, etc. Additionally, China disrupts materials and supply chains to its advantage and manipulates its currency to gain favorable trade positions. And then on top of that, China's human rights violations are also a matter of concern. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has strategically expanded into several NATO member states through the Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes using predatory tactics that they can then use against the countries that have made these agreements, thus raising security concerns among alliance members. Now, while Japan has long viewed China's behaviors as threatening, we all know that Japan and China really haven't gotten along ever. But NATO is now starting to share some of the same views. And this has prompted the alliance to increase its presence in the Indo-Pacific region and collaborate with partners such as South Korea, Australia, as well as Japan in the area. French and British ships have conducted freedom of maneuver exercises through international waters of the Taiwan Strait. Now, NATO doesn't view China as an adversary in the traditional sense, or even in the same vein as Russia. Russia is clearly the NATO adversary. Engagement with Beijing is necessary because trade still takes place. They haven't been cut off from the world, similar to how Russia has been. And they are critical in stopping things like nuclear proliferation or assisting in climate change because, unfortunately, China is one of the biggest polluters. However, Beijing has not condemned Moscow's aggression in Ukraine and instead is strengthening economic ties, diplomatic ties, and military cooperation with Russia. Now, obviously, China has expressed disapproval on several occasions regarding the alignment between NATO and Japan, calling it a push for bloc confrontation that requires high vigilance. They also are taking note that South Korea is becoming closer to NATO. At the Shangri-La Dialogue, a top security summit in Asia held in June of this year, Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu criticized such ties in the region, referring to them as holding countries hostage and exacerbating conflict and confrontation. Russia, coming to the aid of, or not really, just having the back of China, has said that NATO was planned to open an office in Tokyo as further evidence of NATO's ambitions to entrench the region and spread anti-Russian and anti-China propaganda. Both China and Russia use such rhetoric all the time to gain support for otherwise unpopular or costly foreign policy ideas such as invading Ukraine or investing in terrible Belt and Road initiatives across Africa and then demanding access to basing in those regions, and then also just framing the United States and the West as threats to their sovereignty, despite the fact that the U.S. has never invaded either country. With regard to Taiwan, NATO's official position on Taiwan is that it opposes any unilateral change to the status quo in the East China Sea, which would have global security ramifications. So basically, no one attacks anyone, and we just keep moving forward as we always have been. The bottom line for China is just because NATO is located in the North Atlantic, its concerns and potential enemies are global. China's economic policies influence the economic health and policies of NATO member states. China's military expansion and modernization, especially in the South China Sea, pose a potential threat to NATO trade through the region. China's ties to Russia directly threaten European security. Chinese cyber attacks directly target NATO allies. And it's not like China is innocent here. They conduct military movements and have been operating in the West as well. The Chinese Navy has conducted live fire drills in the Mediterranean. And they have had on and off operations in Cuba for decades. Any Chinese attack on Guam, which is a U.S. territory in the Pacific Ocean, could represent an assault on NATO. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General said China in particular is watching to see the price Russia pays or the reward it receives for its aggression in Ukraine. Leaders in South Korea and Japan are also clearly concerned with what was happening in Europe and that it could happen in Asia tomorrow. So if China thinks that it is granted immunity from NATO because it is not regionally located in the North Atlantic, it is seriously mistaken. China is now on NATO's radar because of its proximity to Russia and ties to Russia, but also its belligerent efforts in what are generally NATO-aligned countries, and countries such as South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, as well as other countries that are aligned with Western values in the region, to include Philippines, increasingly Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. Those are countries that are moving in a more Western-aligned path, and of course Taiwan as well. So China is something NATO is going to continue to keep an eye on, and obviously China is going to grow more and more irritated with the microscope being on top of them, as well as Russia.